Please, somebody help me. The scream echoed through the emergency department like a battle cry, raw and desperate. Rebecca Sterling stumbled through the automatic doors, her 8-month pregnant belly straining against a blood-stained hospital gown she'd clearly thrown on in haste. Sarah Knox froze at the nurse's station, her pen hovering over patient charts. That voice. She knew that voice better than her own heartbeat, even after 2 years of painful silence between them. 2 years since their last fight about Jonathan. 2 years since Rebecca had chosen her husband over family warnings. "I need a doctor now," Rebecca gasped, clutching her swollen belly with trembling hands. Blood seeped through the thin fabric of her gown, and her face was ghostly pale beneath perfectly applied makeup that couldn't quite hide the exhaustion etched around her eyes. Behind her, Jonathan Sterling followed at a measured pace, his perfectly pressed charcoal suit and cold expression a stark contrast to his wife's panic. He walked like a man annoyed by an inconvenience, checking his platinum watch and muttering into his Bluetooth headset about disrupted board meetings and Singapore investors. Sarah's military training kicked in, overriding 2 years of hurt feelings and wounded pride. Combat medics don't abandon casualties, not even when those casualties have broken your heart by choosing abusive men over protective sisters. She dropped her charts and rushed forward. "Get me a wheelchair and call Dr. Hammond stat," Sarah barked to the nearest orderly, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned commanding field hospitals in Afghanistan. "And prep Trauma Bay 3. As she helped Rebecca onto the gurney, Sarah's trained eyes caught details that made her stomach clench. Fresh, finger-shaped bruises on Rebecca's upper arms, dark purple against pale skin, a healing cut along her scalp, carefully hidden by styled blonde hair. The way Rebecca flinched when male staff approached, then forced herself to smile apologetically. "Becca, what happened?" Sarah whispered as they raced toward the trauma bay, her hands checking vitals with automatic efficiency. Rebecca's pulse was rapid and thready, blood pressure dangerously low. "I fell," Rebecca lied, her blue eyes darting nervously toward Jonathan, who trailed behind them, still talking business on his phone. "Down the stairs at home. I'm so clumsy lately." But Sarah recognized the signs. She'd seen them in combat zones where women suffered in silence, where violence hid behind closed doors, and victims learned to lie with practiced ease. The defensive posture, the fear masked as clumsiness, the way Rebecca's hand instinctively moved to protect her belly, as if expecting another blow. Rebecca Sterling, age 30, approximately 32 weeks pregnant. Sarah rattled off to Dr. Patricia Hammond as the emergency room physician hurried over. "Complains of abdominal pain and vaginal bleeding following alleged fall downstairs?" Dr. Hammond's experienced eyes took in the scene quickly. She'd been practicing emergency medicine for 20 years, long enough to read between the lines of Sarah's carefully chosen word alleged. "Let's get her on the monitor," Dr. Hammond ordered, pulling on latex gloves. "Full fetal assessment, complete blood count, and type and cross-match for possible transfusion." As they transferred Rebecca to the examination table, Sarah noticed more troubling signs. Old yellowing bruises on Rebecca's ribs, exposed when they lifted her gown, defensive scars on her hands and forearms. The way she apologized constantly, as if her very presence was an inconvenience. "I'm sorry for causing trouble," Rebecca whispered as Sarah attached the fetal heart monitor. "I know you're busy, and I should have been more careful on the stairs." The baby's heartbeat filled the room, rapid and irregular. Sarah watched the monitor display with growing alarm as the numbers fluctuated wildly. She'd assisted with enough high-risk pregnancies to know when something was seriously wrong. Dr. Hammond's face went grave as she studied the ultrasound screen. The baby's heart rate was dropping, and there were clear signs of fetal distress. Blood pooled in Rebecca's abdomen, indicating internal bleeding that had nothing to do with any fall downstairs. "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Hammond addressed Jonathan, who had finally ended his phone call and approached the trauma bay. "Your wife is bleeding internally. The baby is showing signs of severe distress. We need to prep for emergency surgery immediately." Jonathan's response chilled the room to absolute silence. "How long will this take? I have investors flying in from Singapore tonight. The IPO presentation cannot be delayed." Rebecca's face crumpled as if he'd slapped her in front of everyone. Even now, facing the potential loss of their child, Jonathan treated her like a business problem to be managed efficiently. Sarah watched her sister's spirit break a little more, watched her shoulders curve inward in the defensive posture of someone who'd learned to make herself small. "Sir," Dr. Hammond said with barely controlled anger, "your wife and child could die without immediate surgical intervention." "Yes, well, do what you need to do," Jonathan replied dismissively, already reaching for his phone again. "I'll be in the waiting room handling urgent matters." Sarah remembered why she'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, why she'd volunteered for the most dangerous assignments treating wounded soldiers under enemy fire. She'd fought to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. She'd sworn an oath to heal, to comfort, to never abandon those in need. Looking at her sister's broken expression, Sarah realized the war had followed her home. As they prepped Rebecca for emergency surgery, Sarah squeezed her sister's hand. Despite the pain and fear, Rebecca managed a weak smile that broke Sarah's heart all over again. "I missed you so much," Rebecca whispered. "I know you were right about him. I know you tried to warn me." "Save your strength," Sarah replied, but her voice was thick with emotion. "We're going to take good care of you and the baby." Dr. Hammond's expression grew increasingly grim as test results came back. The internal bleeding was severe, and the baby's distress signals were becoming critical. They had minutes, not hours, to act. "We need to move now," Dr. Hammond announced, releasing the brake on Rebecca's gurney. "Full surgical team to OR3 immediately." As Rebecca was wheeled toward the operating room, she grabbed Sarah's arm with desperate strength, her fingers digging in like claws. "If something happens to me," Rebecca whispered urgently, "protect my baby from him. Promise me, Sarah, protect my baby from becoming like his father." The words hit Sarah like shrapnel. Rebecca knew, deep down, past all the lies and excuses and desperate hope. Rebecca knew exactly what kind of man she'd married, and she was terrified of leaving her child alone with him. "I promise," Sarah said firmly, watching her sister disappear behind the surgical suite doors. "I promise you both will be safe." As the doors swung shut, Sarah stood alone in the hallway, still wearing gloves stained with her sister's blood. Through the waiting room window, she could see Jonathan pacing while barking orders into his phone, his face showing more emotion about whatever business crisis he was managing than he'd displayed when told his wife and child might die. For the first time since leaving Afghanistan, Sarah felt the familiar weight of a mission settling on her shoulders. This wasn't about family reconciliation anymore. This was about protecting civilians from a dangerous enemy who happened to share their home address. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. "Your wife is bleeding internally from blunt force trauma," Dr. Hammond announced to Jonathan 3 hours later, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years' experience treating victims of violence. "The fetal distress was caused by severe abdominal impact. We managed to stop the hemorrhaging and stabilize the baby. But this wasn't caused by any fall." Jonathan's expression didn't change. He stood perfectly still in his expensive suit, checking his Rolex as if the doctor were discussing quarterly earnings reports rather than his wife's near-death experience. "How long before she can come home?" he asked. "We have several important social obligations this week." Sarah watched from the nurse's station, fury building in her chest like steam in a pressure cooker. She'd seen warlords show more compassion for enemy wounded than Jonathan displayed for his own wife and child. Dr. Hammond studied Jonathan with the clinical assessment of someone who'd learned to recognize predators in expensive clothing. "Mr. Sterling, your wife suffered significant internal trauma. The impact pattern suggests—" "Doctor," Jonathan interrupted smoothly, "my wife is extremely clumsy, especially during pregnancy. She's always been accident-prone. I'm sure you understand how hormonal changes can affect coordination and judgment." The words were delivered with practiced ease, as if he'd rehearsed this exact conversation. Sarah realized with growing horror that he probably had. This wasn't his first time explaining away Rebecca's accidents to medical professionals. "Sir, I've been treating trauma victims for 2 decades, Dr. Hammond replied firmly. "These injuries are consistent with deliberate assault, not accidental falls." Jonathan's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the concerned husband facade. "Doctor, I think you're overreaching your medical expertise. My wife's condition is clearly related to pregnancy complications exacerbated by her sister's military-related mental health issues." Sarah felt the words hit like a physical blow. Jonathan had just weaponized her combat service, turning her 3 tours in Afghanistan into ammunition against her credibility. She'd saved lives, treated wounded soldiers under enemy fire, earned commendations for bravery under impossible conditions. And now he was twisting her service into evidence of instability. What's my sister's military service have to do with Rebecca's internal bleeding? Sarah asked, stepping closer to the conversation. Sarah, isn't it? Jonathan turned toward her with a smile that never reached his eyes. Rebecca's told me so much about your difficulties adjusting to civilian life. Post-traumatic stress can manifest in many ways, including false accusations and paranoid thinking about family members. Dr. Hammond looked between them, clearly recognizing the manipulation tactic. Mr. O'Sterling, regardless of family dynamics, I'm required by law to report suspected domestic violence. These injuries require investigation. Of course, Jonathan agreed readily. I want what's best for my wife and child, but I hope you'll consider the source of these accusations. Rebecca's sister has been estranged from our family for 2 years due to her inability to maintain healthy relationships. Military trauma often creates distorted perceptions of normal family interactions. Sarah watched him work, grudgingly impressed by the skill of his manipulation. He wasn't denying the injuries that would be too easily disproven. Instead, he was building a narrative where Rebecca's wounds were real, but caused by her own clumsiness. And any testimony to the contrary came from an unreliable source with documented mental health issues. It was brilliantly executed psychological warfare. I'd like to see my sister now, Sarah said firmly. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Jonathan replied. Rebecca needs rest, and frankly, your presence seems to agitate her. The stress isn't good for the baby. Dr. Hammond intervened. Nurse Knox is part of our trauma team. She has legitimate medical reasons to check on the patient. But as they walked toward Rebecca's recovery room, Sarah noticed Jonathan following at a careful distance, always within earshot but never close enough to appear threatening to casual observers. Rebecca was awake but groggy from anesthesia, her face pale against white hospital pillows. The fetal monitor showed the baby's heartbeat had stabilized, but Rebecca's vital signs still indicated severe stress and trauma. How are you feeling? Sarah asked gently, checking the IV lines and monitoring equipment. Tired, Rebecca whispered. Is the baby okay? The baby's stable. Dr. Hammond says you'll both recover fully with proper rest and care. Rebecca's eyes darted toward the doorway, where Jonathan stood talking quietly with a well-dressed woman Sarah didn't recognize. Even heavily sedated, Rebecca tensed when she saw them together. Who's that with Jonathan? Sarah asked. His public relations manager, Rebecca replied quietly. Melissa something. She handles crisis management for Sterling Tech. Sarah felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Jonathan hadn't just called lawyers, he'd activated his entire corporate damage control team. This wasn't a family emergency to him. It was a potential scandal requiring professional management. Becca, Sarah said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Did Jonathan hit you? Rebecca's hand moved instinctively to her bruised ribs, then stopped as she noticed Jonathan watching through the window. I fell down the stairs, Sarah. I told you already. But her eyes said something entirely different. They screamed for help while her voice maintained the lie that had kept her alive for 2 years. The medical evidence doesn't support that story, Sarah pressed gently. Dr. Hammond says your injuries are consistent with being struck, not with falling. Dr. Hammond is wrong, Rebecca insisted, but tears started flowing down her cheeks. Jonathan loves me. He takes good care of me. He just gets stressed about work sometimes. Sarah recognized the classic pattern, minimizing, rationalizing, accepting blame for someone else's violence. She'd seen it in military families where power imbalances created perfect conditions for abuse. But she'd never seen it this close to home. Becca, you almost died today. Your baby almost died. If someone is hurting you, no one is hurting me. Rebecca's voice rose, then immediately dropped to a whisper as she glanced nervously toward the door. Please don't say things like that. Jonathan has a lot of important connections. People depend on Sterling Tech for their jobs. I can't be responsible for destroying all of that. The words revealed the trap Rebecca had been caught in. Jonathan hadn't just isolated her from family support, he'd convinced her that his success was her responsibility, that any threat to his reputation would destroy innocent people's livelihoods. Classic abuser tactic, making the victim complicit in maintaining the abuse by claiming others would suffer if the truth came out. "Rebecca," Sarah said firmly, "you're not responsible for other people's jobs. You're responsible for protecting yourself and your baby." "You don't understand," Rebecca sobbed quietly. "Jonathan's company is worth hundreds of millions. He has lawyers, connections, power I can't even imagine. If I leave him, I'll lose everything. My baby will have nothing." "Your baby will have a living mother." "Will I?" Rebecca's question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. "Jonathan said if I ever told anyone about our private business, he'd make sure I never saw my child again. He has custody lawyers on retainer. Sarah, he has judges who owe him favors. What chance do I have against all of that?" Sarah felt the full scope of Jonathan's control strategy revealing itself. He hadn't just been hitting Rebecca, he'd been systematically destroying her sense of agency, her belief in her own power, her connection to anyone who might help her fight back. Isolation, intimidation, economic control, legal threats. Textbook psychological warfare designed to create a victim who would never dare to fight back. Through the recovery room window, Sarah watched Jonathan charm the nursing staff with expensive coffee and concerned husband performance art, but his eyes remained cold and calculating, constantly assessing threats and managing his public image. "I want to help you," Sarah said, "but I need you to trust me." "I can't," Rebecca whispered. "Not yet. It's too dangerous." As if summoned by their conversation, Jonathan appeared in the doorway with a massive floral arrangement and his practiced smile. "How's my beautiful wife feeling?" he asked, his voice warm with false concern. "I brought your favorite roses." Sarah watched Rebecca's entire demeanor change. Her shoulders tensed, her breathing became shallow, and she forced a grateful smile that looked more like a grimace. "Thank you, honey. They're beautiful." Jonathan set the flowers on the bedside table and leaned down to kiss Rebecca's forehead. To anyone watching, it would look like a tender moment between devoted spouses. But Sarah saw Rebecca flinch almost imperceptibly when his lips touched her skin. "The doctors say you need lots of rest," Jonathan continued. "I've arranged for private security to make sure you're not disturbed by unnecessary visitors while you recover." Sarah's military training screamed danger. Private security wasn't protection, it was surveillance. Jonathan was putting guards around Rebecca under the guise of caring for her safety. "That's not necessary," Sarah said. "Hospital security is excellent, and family can provide support." "Thank you for your concern, Sarah, but Rebecca's needs are my responsibility now." Jonathan's tone remained pleasant, but his eyes conveyed a clear message: back off. "Actually, Dr. Hammond appeared in the doorway. "I need to discuss some concerns with both family members present." Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, doctor. Whatever's best for Rebecca's health." But Sarah could see him calculating, planning his next move in this chess match where her sister's life hung in the balance. The war was escalating. The internal bleeding was caused by blunt force trauma to the abdomen. Dr. Hammond announced to Sarah privately 3 hours after Jonathan had left to handle urgent business matters. "These weren't injuries from a fall. Someone struck your sister with significant force." Sarah stood in the empty family consultation room, fluorescent lights humming overhead like insects. Through the window, she could see Rebecca sleeping fitfully, still connected to monitors that tracked both her heartbeat and her baby's fragile life. "I know," Sarah replied quietly, "but she won't admit it. She's terrified of him." "I've seen this pattern before with wealthy abusers," Dr. Hammond continued. "They use their resources as weapons, legal teams, social connections, financial control. They make victims believe resistance is impossible." Sarah's mind shifted into tactical mode, the same mental framework she'd used planning medical evacuations under enemy fire. Assessment, resources, objectives, threats. Rebecca was the casualty. Jonathan was the enemy. The baby was the mission. "What can we do legally?" Sarah asked. "I'm required to report suspected domestic violence, but that's also dangerous. Documentation can protect victims, but it can also escalate violence if the abuser feels cornered." Sarah understood. Too early, and the report would alert Jonathan to increase his control measures. Too late, and Rebecca might not survive the next accident. Can I review Rebecca's medical history? Sarah asked. I'm her next of kin and a medical professional. Dr. Hammond hesitated, then pulled up Rebecca's file on the computer terminal. What Sarah saw made her stomach drop. 5 emergency room visits in the past 2 years. Broken wrist from jogging accident. Concussion from walking into cabinet door. Bruised ribs from slipping in shower. Each incident had occurred within days of major Sterling Tech milestones, company expansion announcements, IPO preparation meetings, board presentations. The pattern was clear. Jonathan's violence escalated when he felt professional pressure or stress. He took out his business frustrations on his wife, then used his resources to cover up the evidence. Look at the insurance information, Dr. Hammond said quietly. Sarah scrolled down and felt her blood run cold. Rebecca had been using company health insurance under a slightly altered name, Rebecca S. Sterling instead of Rebecca Ann Sterling. The billing address was a P.O. box, not their home address. She's been hiding the medical visits from him, Sarah realized, or he's been forcing her to hide them to avoid creating a paper trail that could damage his reputation if they ever divorced. Sarah thought about Jonathan's perfectly orchestrated public image. Sterling Tech was preparing for a massive IPO that would make him worth hundreds of millions. Any hint of domestic violence charges would destroy investor confidence and tank the company's valuation. Rebecca wasn't just a wife to him, she was a potential liability that had to be managed carefully. I need to talk to her again, Sarah said. When she returned to Rebecca's room, her sister was awake and staring out the window at the city skyline. In daylight, the bruises on her arms looked even darker, and Sarah noticed a healing cut on Rebecca's scalp that had been hidden by carefully styled hair during the previous visit. How are you feeling? Sarah asked. Scared, Rebecca admitted quietly. Not about the medical stuff, about what comes next. Sarah pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. Tell me what you're afraid of. Jonathan's already planning damage control. I heard him on the phone with his lawyers while I was pretending to sleep. They're building a case that I'm mentally unstable, that you're filling my head with paranoid delusions because of your PTSD. The strategy was sophisticated and cruel. Jonathan was preemptively discrediting both potential witnesses against him while appearing concerned and supportive to outside observers. What else did you hear? He's hired private investigators to dig up information about your military service, looking for anything that makes you appear unreliable. Medical records, incident reports, anything he can use to paint you as an unstable veteran with grudges against successful men. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. Jonathan wasn't just defending himself, he was going on the offensive, using her own service record as ammunition against her. Her deployment medical files, her combat stress evaluations, her therapy sessions after returning home, all of it could be twisted to support his narrative. He's also contacted hospital administration, Rebecca continued, claiming that having you on my care team violates conflict of interest policies because of our contentious family history and your documented mental health issues. The trap was brilliant and brutal. Jonathan was systematically removing every potential ally Rebecca had, while maintaining the appearance of a concerned husband, protecting his fragile wife from unstable family members. Becca, I want you to know that none of that matters to me. I'm not going anywhere. But what if they make you go away? What if they transfer you to another department or suspend you while they investigate his complaints? Sarah realized Rebecca's deepest fear wasn't physical violence. It was abandonment. Jonathan had spent 2 years isolating her from family and friends, convincing her that no one would help her, that she was completely alone. The possibility of losing Sarah again terrified her more than the threat of more beatings. Look at me, Sarah said firmly. I survived 3 combat tours in Afghanistan. I've treated wounded soldiers while enemy mortars exploded around our field hospital. I'm not afraid of some corporate bully in an expensive suit. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. But he's not just some bully, Sarah. He's incredibly smart, incredibly connected, and he has unlimited resources. He owns judges, politicians, police chiefs. He's donated millions to charities, sits on hospital boards, employs thousands of people. Who's going to believe 2 women against all of that? The scope of Jonathan's power network was staggering, but Sarah had fought against overwhelming odds before. In Afghanistan, she'd learned that even the most well-equipped enemies had vulnerabilities if you were patient enough to find them. Does he hit you regularly? Sarah asked. Rebecca was quiet for a long time. It's not regular. Maybe once a month. Sometimes more when he's stressed about work. He's always sorry afterward. He brings flowers, jewelry, takes me on expensive trips, says it won't happen again. But it always does happen again. Yes, Rebecca whispered. And it's been getting worse since I got pregnant. He says the stress of becoming a father is overwhelming, that he never wanted children but agreed to make me happy. Classic escalation pattern. Pregnancy often triggered increased violence in abusive relationships because it represented a loss of control for the abuser. The victim's attention shifted to the baby. Their body changed beyond the abuser's control, and the legal complications of divorce became more complex with children involved. Have you ever thought about leaving? Every day, Rebecca admitted. But where would I go? He controls all our bank accounts. Our house is in his name only. My car is registered to his company. I haven't worked in 3 years because he wanted me to focus on being a good wife. I have no money, no job skills that haven't gone stale, no credit history separate from his. Financial abuse was another layer of control. Jonathan had systematically eliminated Rebecca's economic independence, making escape seem impossible even if she found the courage to try. What about our mother Grace would help you? He's already poisoned that well, told her I've been struggling with depression and paranoid thoughts during pregnancy, suggested that my accusations against him are symptoms of prenatal mental health issues that need professional treatment. Sarah felt her anger building like pressure in a steam boiler. Jonathan's strategy was comprehensive and ruthless: isolate the victim, control the narrative, discredit potential witnesses, maintain public sympathy, and ensure that any attempt at escape would be portrayed as the desperate actions of an unstable woman. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the bond between sisters who'd grown up protecting each other, and he'd never faced an enemy who'd learned combat tactics from actual warfare. Becca, I need you to trust me on something. Can you do that? Rebecca nodded hesitantly. Start keeping a record. Dates, times, photos of injuries, copies of medical records. Hide everything where he can't find it. If we're going to fight him, we need ammunition. What if he finds out? What if he realizes I'm collecting evidence? Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But doing nothing guarantees you'll be trapped forever. Rebecca was quiet for several minutes, staring at her hands folded over her pregnant belly. When she looked up, Sarah saw a flicker of the fierce little sister who'd once fought neighborhood bullies despite being half their size. Okay, Rebecca said. But Sarah, if something goes wrong, if he hurts me worse or takes my baby away, I need you to know that none of this is your fault. You tried to warn me before I married him. You tried to save me then, and you're trying to save me now. Nothing's going to happen to you or the baby. I promise. But even as Sarah made the vow, she knew she was entering a war where the enemy held every advantage except one. He'd never faced an opponent who'd learned to fight for other people's lives in places where failure meant death. The mission was clear. The stakes were absolute. The enemy had been identified. I've reviewed your sister's case, Detective Michael Crawford said during their private meeting in the hospital cafeteria the next morning. Officially, I can't do anything yet. We need either a victim willing to press charges or evidence of imminent danger. Sarah stirred her coffee and studied the detective's weathered face. Crawford looked like he'd seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the signs, but also enough wealthy defendants to understand the challenges they faced. What do we need to build a case? Sarah asked. Documentation, witnesses, physical evidence. But here's the problem. Jonathan Sterling isn't some regular abuser we can arrest and process through normal channels. He's got more political connections than the mayor and enough money to hire better lawyers than the district attorney's office. Sarah had anticipated this response. Wealth and power created different rules of engagement, different tactical considerations. What about federal charges if his company has defense contracts? Interesting angle, Crawford interrupted. Sterling Tech does have several lucrative government contracts for surveillance software. Any evidence of domestic violence might trigger security clearance reviews, especially if it suggests psychological instability or vulnerability to blackmail. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah felt a spark of strategic hope. Jonathan's greatest strength, his business empire, might also be his most vulnerable point. How would that process work? Federal security clearance investigations are thorough and confidential. They interview associates, review medical records, examine financial patterns, the kind of scrutiny that makes wealthy men very nervous. Sarah filed this information away for future use. But first, she needed to ensure Rebecca's immediate safety. Detective, what happens if I report suspected domestic violence without the victim's cooperation? The report gets filed. We conduct a preliminary investigation, but without victim testimony, prosecution is unlikely. However, it does create official documentation that can be crucial if the violence escalates. That afternoon, Sarah returned to Rebecca's room to find Jonathan holding court with several hospital administrators. He was dressed impeccably as always, playing the role of concerned husband and generous hospital benefactor. "Ah, Sarah," Jonathan said when he noticed her arrival. "Perfect timing. I was just explaining to Mr. Williams here about the generous donation Sterling Tech is planning for the new maternity ward." Hospital Administrator Williams beamed with gratitude. "Mr. Sterling's commitment to community healthcare is truly inspiring. We're so fortunate to have community leaders like him supporting our mission." Sarah watched the performance with grudging respect for its skillful execution. Jonathan was building goodwill and social capital that would make questioning his character seem ungrateful and petty. "Actually," Jonathan continued, "I wanted to discuss a small concern about staffing assignments. Given the personal history between Rebecca and her sister, I'm worried that having Sarah involved in her care might create unnecessary emotional stress during this delicate time." Williams nodded sympathetically. "Family dynamics can complicate medical care. Perhaps it would be better to assign a different nurse to Mrs. Sterling's case." "That won't be necessary," Dr. Hammond interjected, appearing suddenly at Sarah's shoulder. "Nurse Knox is one of our most experienced trauma specialists. Medical decisions will be based on clinical expertise, not family politics." Jonathan's smile never wavered, but Sarah caught a flash of irritation in his eyes. "Of course, doctor. I just want what's best for Rebecca's recovery." After the administrators left, Jonathan approached Sarah directly. "You know, I understand why you might have concerns about Rebecca," he said quietly. "Military service can create hypervigilance, a tendency to see threats where none exist. It's not your fault, it's a natural consequence of combat trauma." The words were delivered with apparent sympathy, but Sarah recognized the manipulation technique. He was offering her an excuse to blame her concerns on PTSD, accept the comfortable narrative that her perceptions were distorted, and everyone could move forward without uncomfortable questions. "My perception is fine," Sarah replied calmly. "I see exactly what's happening here." "What do you think you see?" "I see a man who shows more emotion about business meetings than his wife's life-threatening medical emergency. I see someone who's more concerned about hospital donations and public image than his pregnant wife's injuries. I see classic patterns of control and intimidation." Jonathan's mask slipped slightly. "You see what you want to see. Rebecca is clumsy, has always been accident-prone. Pregnancy makes it worse. I've been patient and supportive through dozens of minor injuries over the years. Dozens of injuries. Rebecca never told you. The broken wrist last year, the concussion the year before, various cuts and bruises from falls and accidents. I've spent thousands on medical bills. Never complained. Always been understanding about her coordination problems." Sarah realized Jonathan was building a historical narrative that portrayed Rebecca as naturally injury-prone, someone whose current trauma was just the latest in a long series of accidents. It was brilliant defense strategy, preemptive explanation that would make future injuries seem predictable, rather than suspicious. "Where were you when Rebecca fell down the stairs?" Sarah asked. "At the office, unfortunately. Saturday morning board meeting preparation. When I got home, I found her bleeding and immediately brought her here. I blame myself for not being there to prevent the accident." Even his alibi was crafted to generate sympathy. The devoted husband working weekends to provide for his family, feeling guilty about not being present to protect his accident-prone wife. "What time did you find her?" "Around 11:30. "Why do you ask?" Sarah didn't answer, but she filed the timeline away for future verification. If Rebecca had been struck that morning, the medical evidence might contradict Jonathan's story about when the injuries occurred. That evening, after visiting hours ended, Sarah made her way to Rebecca's room for an unofficial check. Her sister was awake, staring at the ceiling with the blank expression of someone lost in traumatic memories. "Can't sleep?" Sarah asked quietly. "Every time I close my eyes, I see his face when he gets angry. The way his whole personality changes, like someone else takes over his body. Tell me about this morning. What really happened? Rebecca was quiet for a long time. We had an argument about the baby's name. I wanted to name him Matthew, after Dad. Jonathan wanted something more distinctive, more befitting a Sterling family heir. That sounds like a normal disagreement. It was, at first. But then I said something about wanting our son to have Dad's kindness and integrity. Jonathan exploded. Said Dad was a weak man who died poor because he was too stupid to capitalize on opportunities. Sarah felt her own anger flare. Their father had been a high school teacher who devoted his life to helping struggling students. He died of cancer when Sarah was deployed overseas, leaving behind a legacy of lives touched and communities improved. Calling him weak was unforgivable. What happened next? Jonathan grabbed me by the shoulders and started shaking me, screaming about how I was already poisoning his son against him with sentimental garbage about my pathetic family. Then Rebecca's voice broke. Take your time. He punched me in the stomach, said he'd rather have no child than one raised to be soft like the Sterling women. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Jonathan hadn't just lost his temper, he deliberately targeted Rebecca's pregnancy, attacking both mother and unborn child in a calculated act of violence. That's when I started bleeding and called for help. But by the time we got here, he'd already invented the story about falling downstairs. Becca, this is attempted murder. He could have killed you and the baby. I know, Rebecca whispered, and he knows it too. I think that scared him enough to make him more careful about covering his tracks. Sarah understood now why Jonathan had been so prepared with explanations and alibis. This morning's violence had crossed a line even for him, and he was desperately trying to control the aftermath. We need to report this, Sarah said. Not yet. He's planning something. I can see it in how he's been talking to people, building sympathy, managing the narrative. If we move too fast, he'll destroy us both. Rebecca was right. Jonathan was conducting his own information warfare campaign, and they needed to be equally strategic in their response. What do you want to do? Exactly what you suggested yesterday. Document everything. Build evidence. Wait for the right moment. But Sarah, when we do make our move, we have to be absolutely certain we can win. Because if we fail, I'll never get another chance. Outside the hospital window, the city lights twinkled like distant stars. Somewhere out there, Jonathan was planning his next moves in this deadly game of chess where Rebecca and her baby were the ultimate prizes. Sarah thought about the tactical principle she'd learned in military training. Sometimes the best defense is preparation for an inevitable offense. Jonathan might hold the current advantage, but wars weren't won by single battles. The enemy had revealed his true nature. Now it was time to plan the counterattack. Sarah arrived at work the next morning to find a formal letter waiting in her staff mailbox. Hospital Human Resources wanted to meet with her regarding concerns raised about professional conduct and potential conflicts of interest in patient care assignments. Jonathan was escalating his campaign. Bastard works fast, muttered Amanda Wells, the hospital social worker, reading over Sarah's shoulder. Amanda was a sharp-eyed woman in her late 20s who'd seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize manipulation tactics across all social classes. You expected this? Sarah asked. Rich abusers always go after the support system first. Isolate the victim, discredit the witnesses, control the narrative. Sterling's just doing it with more expensive lawyers and better PR. Sarah had worked with Amanda on several difficult cases involving military families, and she trusted the younger woman's instincts about predatory behavior. Can you help me understand what we're dealing with? Sarah asked. Amanda pulled up Sterling Tech's corporate information on her computer. Jonathan Sterling, 38 years old, CEO and founder of Sterling Technology Solutions. Company specializes in surveillance software for government and corporate clients. Annual revenue around $200 million. We're preparing for IPO that could push valuation over $1 billion. The numbers were staggering, but Sarah focused on the business model. Surveillance software meant Jonathan understood information warfare, data collection, and privacy invasion at a professional level. Look at this, Amanda continued, scrolling through news articles. Sterling Tech has contracts with Homeland Security, Defense Department, several three-letter agencies. Jonathan has security clearances that require regular psychological evaluations and lifestyle investigations. Sarah felt another piece of the tactical puzzle clicking into place. Those clearances would be jeopardized by domestic violence charges. Exactly. And here's the interesting part. Sterling Tech is majority owned by Jonathan personally. If he loses his security clearances, the government contracts disappear, and the company becomes worthless overnight. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah saw a potential weapon that could match Jonathan's resources. His business empire wasn't just his strength, it was also his greatest vulnerability. How do we use that information? Amanda's expression was grim. Carefully. Men like Jonathan don't collapse quietly. They take everyone down with them. That afternoon, Sarah met with Detective Crawford in a small conference room near the police station's domestic violence unit. He'd been investigating Sterling Tech quietly, running background checks and reviewing public records. Interesting pattern, Crawford said, spreading photographs and documents across the table. Jonathan Sterling has been involved in 3 previous relationships that ended badly. First wife divorced him after 18 months, cited irreconcilable differences, but settled out of court with a substantial payout and sealed records. Sarah studied the divorce papers. The settlement amount was blacked out, but the legal language suggested significant financial compensation in exchange for confidentiality agreements. Second relationship was a 2-year engagement to a marketing executive named Jennifer Walsh. Engagement ended abruptly when she was hospitalized for a hiking accident that left her with multiple fractures and internal injuries. Did she press charges? No. And 3 months later, she moved to Seattle with enough money to start her own consulting firm, another sealed settlement, another confidentiality agreement. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Jonathan had been refining his abuse tactics for years, learning how to use wealth and legal pressure to silence victims and erase evidence of his violence. What about the third relationship? Crawford's expression darkened. College girlfriend named Lisa Chen. She died in what was ruled a suicide during their senior year, but the investigating officers noted suspicious circumstances that were never fully explored. Sarah felt cold dread settling in her stomach. What kind of suspicious circumstances? Lisa had filed a campus police report about Jonathan's aggressive behavior 2 weeks before her death. Report was buried after Jonathan's father made a substantial donation to the university. Lisa's roommate told investigators she'd been afraid of Jonathan, said he'd been stalking her after she tried to break up with him, but it was ruled suicide. Lisa jumped from her dormitory roof. No witnesses, no note, no signs of struggle. Jonathan had alibis for the entire evening. He was at a fraternity formal with hundreds of witnesses. Sarah absorbed this information with growing horror. Jonathan's violence wasn't just escalating with Rebecca. It was part of a decades-long pattern of targeting vulnerable women and silencing them through money, intimidation, or worse. Detective, what if Lisa Chen didn't jump? What if she was thrown? I've wondered about that for 15 years. But the case is closed and the evidence is long gone. Sarah realized they weren't just dealing with domestic violence. They were potentially facing someone who'd committed murder and gotten away with it. There's something else, Crawford continued. Sterling Tech's employee records show an unusual pattern of turnover among female staff, especially women in positions where they'd have regular contact with Jonathan. High rates of sudden resignations, early retirements, and transfers to other companies. Workplace harassment, probably, but all covered by non-disclosure agreements and sealed settlement payments. Jonathan's learned how to weaponize the legal system against anyone who threatens his reputation. That evening, Sarah returned to Rebecca's hospital room with a new understanding of the danger they faced. This wasn't just about stopping one incident of domestic violence. They were dealing with a serial predator who'd been perfecting his methods for 20 years. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked. "Better physically. Scared about everything else." Sarah pulled her chair close to the bed. "Becca, I need to ask you some difficult questions about Jonathan's past relationships." Rebecca's expression immediately became guarded. "What about them? Has he ever mentioned previous girlfriends or wives talked about why those relationships ended?" "Not really. He said his first marriage was a mistake, that she was too immature to handle the pressures of his business success. The engagement after that ended because she wasn't supportive of his ambitions." Exactly the kind of victim-blaming narrative Sarah would expect from someone with Jonathan's psychological profile. Did he ever mention anyone named Lisa Chen? Rebecca went very still. How do you know that name? Police records. She was his college girlfriend. She died under suspicious circumstances. Jonathan told me she was mentally unstable, that she committed suicide because she couldn't handle the stress of dating someone successful. He said it taught him to be careful about getting involved with women who weren't emotionally strong enough for serious relationships. Sarah felt sick. Jonathan had turned even Lisa's death into a tool for manipulating future victims, using the tragedy to suggest that women who couldn't handle his behavior were inherently weak or unstable. Becca, what if I told you that Lisa filed a police report about Jonathan's behavior 2 weeks before she died? Rebecca's face crumpled. Then I'd say I'm not the first woman he's tried to destroy, and I probably won't be the last. The weight of that realization settled between them like a physical presence. Rebecca wasn't just fighting for her own safety. She was potentially the only person positioned to stop a predator who'd been operating with impunity for decades. That's why we have to be so careful, Rebecca continued. Jonathan's had 20 years to perfect his system, money, lawyers, connections, public sympathy. He knows exactly how to destroy anyone who threatens him. Sarah understood now why Rebecca had been so terrified of fighting back. She wasn't just afraid of physical violence, she was afraid of being Jonathan's next permanent casualty. But Sarah had advantages that Jonathan's previous victims hadn't possessed. Military training, medical expertise, law enforcement contacts, and most importantly, a deep understanding of how predators operated in high-stakes environments. Becca, tomorrow I want you to start keeping a detailed journal of everything you remember about Jonathan's behavior, his threats, his past statements about other women. Write down dates, times, exact quotes if you can remember them. What if he finds it? We'll hide it somewhere he'd never think to look. But we need documentation that goes beyond just the physical evidence. We need to establish pattern, motive, and escalation over time. Rebecca nodded slowly. Sarah, there's something else you should know. Jonathan's been meeting with custody lawyers since the day I entered the hospital. He's already planning how to take my baby away if I try to leave him. The threat was exactly what Sarah had expected, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch to the gut. Jonathan wasn't just willing to hurt Rebecca, he was prepared to use their child as a weapon against her. Let him plan, Sarah said firmly. We'll be ready. But privately, Sarah knew they were entering the most dangerous phase of their campaign. Jonathan was preparing for war, and men like him didn't fight fair when they felt cornered. The stakes had just become absolute. Your sister needs to leave my husband alone, Jonathan said, cornering Sarah in the hospital parking garage 2 days later. His voice was calm, conversational, but his body language radiated controlled menace. Sarah had been expecting this confrontation. Men like Jonathan eventually abandoned subtle manipulation in favor of direct intimidation when other tactics failed. I'm just doing my job, Sarah replied evenly, not stepping back despite every instinct screaming at her to maintain distance from a known predator. Your job is providing medical care, not filling my pregnant wife's head with paranoid delusions about her loving husband. The words were chosen carefully. Paranoid delusions was the exact phrase Jonathan had been using with hospital administrators, police, and anyone else who might investigate Rebecca's injuries. Those aren't delusions. Those are facts supported by medical evidence. Jonathan stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way designed to trigger fight-or-flight responses. Medical evidence shows my wife fell downstairs. Everything else is speculation from a combat veteran with documented PTSD issues. Sarah recognized the tactic. He was trying to provoke a reaction that would support his narrative about her instability. One aggressive move, one shouted response, one moment of lost control, and Jonathan would have witnesses to her threatening behavior. I saw the ultrasound results, Sarah said quietly. I saw the internal bleeding patterns. I know what blunt force trauma looks like. You know what you want to see, Jonathan countered. But courts require proof, not assumptions from biased family members with personal vendettas. Sarah realized he was essentially confessing while simultaneously explaining why that confession wouldn't matter. He was confident that his resources and connections made him untouchable. What do you want from me? Sarah asked. I want you to stop harassing my wife during her recovery. Stop filling her head with toxic ideas about our marriage. Stop interfering in private family matters that don't concern you. Rebecca's safety concerns me. Rebecca's safety is my responsibility, not yours. I've been protecting and providing for her while you were playing soldier overseas. I know what's best for my family. The dismissive reference to Sarah's military service was designed to minimize her credibility while asserting Jonathan's authority. But Sarah heard something else in his tone, genuine frustration that his usual control tactics weren't working as effectively as expected. If you're such a good husband, why is Rebecca afraid to be alone with you? Jonathan's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing cold rage underneath the concerned husband performance. Rebecca's pregnant and emotional. Pregnancy hormones can cause irrational fears and mood swings. Any obstetrician will confirm that. Even when confronted directly, Jonathan had ready explanations that pathologized Rebecca's reactions while positioning himself as the patient, understanding caregiver. That's not what I see, Sarah said. What you see doesn't matter, Jonathan replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. What matters is what you can prove in court, and you can't prove anything, because there's nothing to prove. Sarah felt the full weight of his confidence in that moment. Jonathan genuinely believed he was untouchable, that his money, connections, and legal preparation made him immune to consequences. Are you threatening me? Sarah asked clearly, loud enough for her words to carry in the concrete garage space. I'm not threatening anyone, Jonathan replied smoothly, immediately returning to normal conversational volume. I'm simply asking you to respect my family's privacy during a difficult time. But his eyes conveyed a different message. Challenge me again, and I'll destroy your career, your reputation, and your future. That afternoon, Sarah found an envelope in her staff mailbox containing copies of her military medical records, personnel evaluations, and therapy session notes from her post-deployment treatment. Someone with serious resources had obtained sealed federal documents and was prepared to use them against her. The message was clear. Jonathan could access any information about her life, her service record, her vulnerabilities. He was demonstrating the scope of his investigative capabilities while reminding her that privacy was a luxury he could revoke at will. Amanda Wells found Sarah sitting in the break room, staring at the leaked documents spread across the table. Jesus Christ, Amanda muttered, recognizing the implications immediately. He really did get your military files. That's federal law violation right there. He's showing me what he's capable of, Sarah replied. This is psychological warfare. It's also stupid. Using illegally obtained federal records as intimidation creates a paper trail back to whoever procured them. Jonathan just gave us evidence of witness tampering and privacy violations. Sarah looked up sharply. You think we can use this against him? Maybe. But first we need to understand how he got access to classified military medical records. That level of document procurement suggests either high-level government connections or criminal conspiracy. That evening, Detective Crawford reviewed the leaked documents with growing amazement and anger. Someone with serious federal access pulled these files, he confirmed. Military medical records are classified information that requires specific clearances and legal justification to obtain. Can we trace who requested them? With a federal investigation? Yes, but that requires probable cause and jurisdictional cooperation that could take months to arrange. Sarah felt the tactical situation clarifying. Jonathan had made a critical error by escalating to federal document theft. His demonstration of power had also created evidence of criminal activity that went far beyond domestic violence charges. Detective, what if Sterling Tech's government contracts gave Jonathan legitimate access to federal databases that he's now using illegally for personal purposes? Crawford's expression sharpened. That would be abuse of security clearances, misuse of classified systems, and violation of about 15 federal statutes. Career-ending, company-destroying stuff. How do we prove it? We need evidence that Jonathan personally requested or received these documents through official channels, then used them for unauthorized purposes. Sarah thought about Rebecca's journal, about the documentation they'd been building, about Jonathan's pattern of using his professional resources for personal control. What if we could demonstrate a pattern of using Sterling Tech resources for domestic surveillance and intimidation? That would trigger a federal security review that could shut down all of Jonathan's government contracts pending investigation. For the first time since this war began, Sarah saw a path to victory that matched Jonathan's own weapons against him. His greatest strength, his security clearances and government connections, could become his greatest vulnerability if they could prove he'd been abusing those privileges. But they needed Rebecca's cooperation to build that case, and Rebecca was still terrified of Jonathan's retaliation. The next morning, Sarah returned to her sister's room to find Rebecca packing a small overnight bag. "Going somewhere?" Sarah asked. "Home," Rebecca replied quietly. "Jonathan says I'm recovered enough to continue resting at home with private nursing care." Sarah felt alarm bells screaming in her mind. Isolated at home with private caregivers chosen by Jonathan, Rebecca would be completely cut off from outside support and medical oversight. "Is that what you want? It's what Jonathan thinks is best for me and the baby?" The words were spoken without emotion, in the flat tone of someone who'd given up fighting for her own agency. "Becca, once you leave the hospital, it'll be much harder for anyone to help you if something goes wrong." "I know," Rebecca replied, "but Jonathan's been very clear about what happens if I don't cooperate with his plans for our recovery period." "What did he threaten?" "That any further disruption of our family peace will result in immediate custody proceedings where my mental stability and family support system will be thoroughly evaluated by court-appointed professionals." Sarah understood the threat. Jonathan was prepared to use the legal system to declare Rebecca an unfit mother if she continued seeking outside help or maintaining contact with potentially destabilizing family members. "That's blackmail. That's marriage to Jonathan Sterling," Rebecca replied with bitter accuracy. As Rebecca finished packing, Sarah realized they were approaching the final phase of this conflict. Jonathan was moving to complete his control over Rebecca and eliminate outside interference. The time for subtle maneuvering was over. The time for direct engagement had arrived. But first, Sarah needed to ensure that when Jonathan made his next move, it would be captured on record by people positioned to use that evidence against him. The trap was ready. Now they just needed the predator to spring it. Sarah burst through the hospital room door just as Jonathan's hand flew toward Rebecca's face. Military reflexes honed by 3 combat tours took over. She intercepted his wrist mid-swing with a grip that could have broken bones if she'd chosen to apply pressure. "Touch her and you're dead," Sarah said with the calm of someone who'd made that promise before, and meant every word. For a moment, the room was frozen in perfect stillness. Jonathan's hand caught inches from Rebecca's face. Sarah's fingers wrapped around his wrist like steel cables. Rebecca pressed back against her hospital bed with terror and hope warring in her eyes. Then Jonathan rallied, his business executive persona snapping back into place like a mask. "Security!" he shouted, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly. "This woman is attacking me. She's having a PTSD episode." Sarah maintained her grip on Jonathan's wrist while speaking clearly for the witnesses she knew would arrive momentarily. "This man was striking his wife. I witnessed assault in progress and intervened to prevent further violence." Hospital security guards appeared in the doorway, followed by Dr. Hammond and Amanda Wells. To their eyes, the scene might look ambiguous. Sarah holding Jonathan's arm while he called for help. Rebecca cowering on the bed. Jonathan immediately shifted tactics, playing victim with practiced skill. "Thank God you're here. Sarah's been stalking my family, making threats, disrupting Rebecca's recovery. Check her military records. She's been struggling with combat-related mental health issues that make her see violence where none exists." For a crucial moment, Sarah saw her entire future hanging in balance. Her military career, her nursing license, her credibility, all of it could be destroyed by Jonathan's connections and carefully constructed narrative about unstable veterans with paranoid delusions. But then Rebecca found her voice. "No," Rebecca said, her words cutting through Jonathan's performance like a blade. "Sarah's telling the truth. Jonathan hits me. He's been hitting me for 2 years." The simple statement landed in the room like a grenade, after months of lies, excuses, and careful cover-ups. Rebecca had finally spoken the truth in front of witnesses who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Jonathan's expression shifted through surprise, rage, and calculation before settling on concerned husband dealing with his wife's mental breakdown. "Rebecca, honey, you're confused. Pregnancy hormones and the trauma of your accident have affected your thinking. You need professional help, not these paranoid fantasies about our marriage." But Amanda Wells stepped forward with a manila folder thick with documentation. "Actually, Mr. Sterling, We have extensive evidence supporting domestic violence allegations, hospital records, police reports, and testimony from multiple witnesses. Sarah watched Jonathan's confidence flicker as he realized his opponents had been building a case while he'd been focused on controlling the immediate situation. "You'll never prove anything," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the steel of someone who'd survived legal challenges before. "My lawyers will destroy all of you. Rebecca's mentally incompetent pregnancy hormones, family trauma, unreliable testimony influenced by her disturbed sister." But Detective Crawford stepped into the room, flanked by two additional officers. "Actually, Mr. Sterling, we've been investigating your activities for several weeks. We have physical evidence, witness testimony, and documentation of a pattern of abuse spanning multiple relationships." Jonathan's mask was cracking now, revealing the cold calculation beneath his public persona. "Pattern of abuse. My previous relationships ended amicably. Any allegations to the contrary are covered by confidentiality agreements that prevent false accusations. Confidentiality agreements don't prevent federal investigation of security clearance violations," Crawford replied calmly. "We've traced the illegal procurement of classified military records back to Sterling Tech's government database access. That's federal crime territory. Mr. Sterling." For the first time since Sarah had known him, Jonathan looked genuinely afraid. His business empire, his security clearances, his entire power structure were suddenly under federal scrutiny. But Jonathan played one final card, reaching toward Rebecca with apparent tenderness while speaking to the assembled witnesses. "Whatever legal issues need to be resolved, my priority is my pregnant wife's health. She's been through tremendous trauma, and all this stress isn't good for our baby." In his arrogance, in his absolute confidence that his reputation and resources made him untouchable, Jonathan reached out to touch Rebecca's face in what would look like a loving gesture to casual observers. Sarah didn't intervene this time. She let him complete the motion. She wanted witnesses to see what Rebecca had endured in private. The slap echoed through the room like a gunshot. Rebecca's head snapped to the side, her cheek immediately reddening from the impact. In that moment, Jonathan's carefully constructed facade collapsed completely. The room erupted in shocked voices, but Detective Crawford's words cut through the chaos. "Jonathan Sterling, you're under arrest for domestic assault. You have the right to remain silent." As handcuffs clicked around Jonathan's wrists, he looked directly at Sarah with pure hatred. "This isn't over. I have resources you can't imagine. I'll destroy you, your sister, and anyone else who thinks they can come after me." But Sarah saw something else in his eyes, the dawning realization that his money and connections couldn't erase what a room full of witnesses had just observed. "The only thing you've destroyed is your own life," Sarah replied quietly. "Rebecca's finally free." As Jonathan was led away, still protesting his innocence and demanding lawyers, Rebecca collapsed back against her pillows with exhaustion and relief. "Is it really over?" she whispered. Sarah took her sister's hand, feeling the trembling gradually subside. "The legal process is just beginning. But Jonathan will never hurt you again." Dr. Hammond approached with growing concern as Rebecca's vital signs showed increasing stress. "We need to monitor both mother and baby closely. This level of trauma could trigger complications." As medical alarms began sounding, Sarah realized their victory might have come at a terrible cost. The battle was won, but the war for Rebecca's life was entering its most critical phase. The fetal heart monitor's urgent beeping filled the room as Rebecca doubled over in pain, her face contorting with the sudden onset of contractions. Dr. Hammond rushed to check the ultrasound display, her expression growing grave as the numbers told a story of crisis. "We have fetal distress and premature labor," Dr. Hammond announced, her voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone who'd delivered thousands of babies under emergency conditions. "The trauma and stress have triggered early delivery at 34 weeks. Sarah felt her world tilting as she watched her sister being prepared for emergency surgery. After everything they'd fought for, after finally breaking free from Jonathan's control, Rebecca and the baby might still pay the ultimate price. "What are the chances?" Sarah asked quietly as nurses wheeled Rebecca toward the operating room. 34 weeks gives us good odds for the baby's survival, but Rebecca's blood pressure is dangerously elevated. The combination of physical trauma, emotional stress, and premature labor creates multiple complications. Sarah followed the gurney as far as hospital protocol allowed, holding Rebecca's hand until the operating room doors separated them. Sarah, Rebecca whispered urgently, if something happens to me, promise you'll protect Matthew from becoming anything like his father. Nothing's going to happen to you, Sarah replied firmly. You're going to raise Matthew yourself, and he's going to grow up knowing exactly what kind of man his father really was. But as the doors swung shut, Sarah stood alone in the hallway, still wearing scrubs stained with her sister's blood, facing the possibility that victory over Jonathan might not matter if Rebecca didn't survive to enjoy her freedom. Tyler arrived within minutes, having driven straight from the firehouse when Sarah called. Her husband pulled her into a fierce embrace, his familiar strength helping to steady her emotional freefall. Any news? Tyler asked. Emergency cesarean section. Rebecca's pressure spiked after the confrontation with Jonathan, triggered premature labor with complications. And Jonathan, in custody, but his lawyers are probably already working on bail arrangements. Rich men don't stay in jail long, even for documented assault. Tyler's jaw tightened with the controlled anger of someone who'd seen too many domestic violence calls end badly. What do we do if he gets out? Sarah realized she hadn't thought beyond the immediate crisis of protecting Rebecca from Jonathan's violence. Now they faced the longer-term challenge of ensuring safety for Rebecca and baby Matthew in a legal system that often favored wealthy defendants with expensive attorneys. Amanda Wells approached with a tablet full of legal documents and procedural forms. We need to discuss protection options while Rebecca's in surgery. Jonathan's lawyers have already filed for emergency custody of the baby, claiming Rebecca's unstable and dangerous. The speed of Jonathan's legal response was breathtaking and terrifying. Even from a jail cell, he was continuing his campaign to control Rebecca through threats against their child. Can they do that? Sarah asked. Rich men with good lawyers can file anything. The question is whether courts will take emergency custody claims seriously when the father is currently in jail for assaulting the mother. Sarah understood that Jonathan's wealth and connections created different rules of engagement, even in the criminal justice system. Bail, plea bargains, suspended sentences, money could transform serious felonies into minor inconveniences for people with sufficient resources. What can we do? Document everything. Today's assault was witnessed by multiple hospital staff, recorded on security cameras, and documented by police. That evidence creates a foundation for permanent protective orders and custody restrictions. Detective Crawford arrived with updates that were both encouraging and sobering. Jonathan made bail, but it's set at $2 million with restrictions. No contact with Rebecca or the baby, surrender of passport, GPS monitoring, and supervised visits only if custody is granted. $2 million isn't much for someone worth hundreds of millions, Tyler observed grimly. True, but federal investigators are now involved because of the security clearance violations. Sterling Tech's government contracts are under review, which could destroy the company's value overnight. Sarah felt a flicker of tactical satisfaction. Jonathan's demonstration of power through leaked military records had created the very federal scrutiny that threatened his entire empire. How long before we know about the baby? Amanda asked. Emergency cesarean sections at 34 weeks usually take 2 to 3 hours, depending on complications, Sarah replied, falling back on medical knowledge to maintain emotional control. As they settled into the surgical waiting room, Sarah reflected on how quickly their lives had been transformed. This morning, Rebecca had been a victim trapped by fear and isolation. Now she was a survivor fighting for her life and her child's future, surrounded by people committed to protecting both. Grace Sterling arrived within the hour, her face streaked with tears and set with determination. Rebecca's mother had driven straight from her home upstate, and she looked like she was prepared for battle. Where is he? Grace demanded, her normally gentle voice carrying steel that reminded Sarah exactly where she and Rebecca had inherited their fighting spirit. In jail, Sarah replied. Finally. Good. And where's my daughter? Emergency surgery. The stress triggered premature labor. Grace's expression softened with worry before hardening again with resolve. That baby is going to need all the protection we can give him. Jonathan's not going to give up custody without a fight. He's facing federal charges now, Detective Crawford explained. Security clearance violations, illegal document procurement, witness intimidation. The domestic violence charges are just the beginning. Grace nodded grimly. I should have spoken up years ago when I first suspected he was hurting Rebecca. I should have intervened before it escalated this far. You couldn't have known how dangerous he really was, Sarah said. None of us understood the full scope of his control tactics. But you figured it out, Grace replied. You came home from war zones to fight another battle for family. I'm proud of you for not giving up on your sister. As evening settled over the hospital, Dr. Hammond finally emerged from the operating room. Her expression was cautiously optimistic, but Sarah could see the exhaustion of someone who'd fought hard to save 2 lives. Both mother and baby are stable, Dr. Hammond announced, her words carrying the weight of answered prayers. Rebecca lost a significant amount of blood and required transfusion, but she's responding well to treatment. Matthew weighed 4 pounds, 8 ounces small but strong. He's breathing independently and showing good vital signs. Sarah felt her knees buckle with relief. Tyler caught her arm, steadying her as the full impact of their survival hit her emotional system. Can we see them? Grace asked. Rebecca's still unconscious from surgery, but stable. Matthew's in the neonatal intensive care unit for monitoring, but you can visit briefly. As they made their way to the NICU, Sarah thought about the long road ahead. Legal battles, custody fights, recovery from trauma, rebuilding Rebecca's independence, all of it would require sustained effort and vigilance. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah felt genuine hope. Rebecca had survived. Matthew had survived. Jonathan was facing consequences that his money and connections couldn't easily dismiss. The most dangerous battle was over. Now came the work of healing and rebuilding lives that had been shattered by years of carefully concealed violence. Looking through the NICU window at her tiny nephew sleeping peacefully in his incubator, Sarah made a silent vow that Matthew Sterling would grow up surrounded by protection, love, and strong role models who would teach him that violence was never acceptable. The war was ending. The peace would be even harder to win. He's beautiful, Rebecca whispered, holding Matthew for the first time 3 days after the emergency delivery. The baby was still small, but his grip was strong as he wrapped tiny fingers around his mother's thumb. Sarah watched her sister cradle her son with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd nearly lost everything. The bruises on Rebecca's face were fading, but her eyes held a new hardness, the look of someone who'd survived hell and was determined never to go back. Any word from Jonathan's lawyers? Rebecca asked quietly, as if speaking his name might summon him back into their lives. They're trying to arrange supervised visitation rights, but Judge Martinez denied the request pending resolution of criminal charges, Amanda Wells reported. Federal investigators are also building cases for security clearance violations and illegal surveillance activities. Sarah felt cautious satisfaction at Jonathan's legal troubles multiplying. Sterling Tech's stock price had crashed when news of the CEO's arrest went public, wiping out hundreds of millions in company value and triggering investor lawsuits. What about custody long-term? Grace asked, settling into the chair beside Rebecca's bed. Their mother had been a constant presence since Matthew's birth, rebuilding the family connections that Jonathan had worked so hard to sever. That's more complicated, Amanda admitted. Even with criminal convictions, fathers retain parental rights unless courts determine they pose ongoing danger to children. Jonathan's lawyers will argue that domestic violence toward the mother doesn't automatically disqualify him from supervised custody. Rebecca's grip tightened protectively around Matthew. I won't let him anywhere near my son, not after what he did. We'll fight every legal battle necessary, Sarah promised, but it's going to require documenting everything, building comprehensive evidence of why Jonathan poses a continuing threat. Dr. Hammond joined their family conference with updates on Rebecca's physical recovery. Medically, you're healing well. Blood counts are normal. Surgical incision is clean, and you should be ready for discharge within a few days. What about Matthew? He's gaining weight and hitting all the developmental milestones we expect for premature infants. Another week in NICU for monitoring. Then he should be ready to go home. Home. The word carried complicated implications now. Rebecca's house was technically marital property, filled with memories of violence and control. She'd need somewhere safe to rebuild her life with Matthew. You're both staying with us until you find a permanent place, Tyler announced, speaking for the first time since entering the room. We've converted the spare bedroom into a nursery, and our security system is military grade. Sarah squeezed her husband's hand gratefully. Tyler understood that protecting family sometimes required long-term commitment, not just immediate intervention. I can't ask you to, Rebecca began. You're not asking, Grace interrupted firmly. You're accepting help from people who love you. That's what families do. Over the following week, their support network expanded as Rebecca's story spread through carefully managed media coverage. Amanda had connected Rebecca with a nonprofit organization supporting domestic violence survivors, particularly women escaping wealthy abusers who used legal and financial resources as weapons. Your case is getting national attention, explained Jennifer Walsh, the organization's director and herself a survivor of Jonathan's violence from years earlier. Women are coming forward with similar stories about wealthy men using the same control tactics. Sarah remembered Jennifer's name from Detective Crawford's investigation, Jonathan's former fiancé, who'd been hospitalized for hiking accident, injuries before accepting a settlement and confidentiality agreement. How many others? Rebecca asked. Dozens, just in the past week. Jonathan's arrest gave them permission to speak about experiences they'd been forced to hide. The scope of Jonathan's predatory behavior was staggering. Police departments in 3 states were reopening old cases involving Sterling Tech employees, business associates, and women from Jonathan's social circles. Federal investigators were finding patterns of surveillance, intimidation, and financial manipulation that suggested systematic abuse of corporate resources for personal control. What happens to all these women if they violate their confidentiality agreements? Rebecca worried. That's the beauty of federal criminal investigation, Detective Crawford explained during one of his regular updates. Evidence obtained through criminal proceedings can't be suppressed by civil confidentiality agreements. Jonathan can't silence witnesses when their testimony relates to federal crimes. Sarah watched her sister absorb this information with growing confidence. Rebecca was beginning to understand that she wasn't just a victim fighting alone. She was part of a larger movement of survivors who could support each other's recovery and justice efforts. Matthew thrived in the NICU environment, growing stronger daily under careful medical supervision. Sarah often found Rebecca sitting beside the incubator, talking quietly to her son about the life they would build together, free from fear and violence. I'm going to teach you that real strength means protecting people who can't protect themselves, Rebecca whispered to Matthew during one of these vigils. I'm going to show you that love doesn't involve control or intimidation or making someone afraid. Sarah listened from the doorway, recognizing in her sister's voice the same determination that had carried her through combat deployments and dangerous medical missions. 2 weeks after Matthew's birth, Jonathan's legal situation deteriorated significantly. Federal prosecutors filed charges including security clearance violations, illegal surveillance, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Sterling Tech lost all government contracts, and the company filed for bankruptcy protection. His entire empire is collapsing, Amanda reported with satisfaction. No more resources for expensive lawyers or private investigators. But Sarah knew that desperate men often became more dangerous, not less, when their control systems failed. What's his bail status? Sarah asked Detective Crawford. Still out on GPS monitoring, but federal charges usually mean pretrial detention. We're pushing for bail revocation based on ongoing witness intimidation. That afternoon, Rebecca received a text message from an unknown number. You've destroyed everything. I hope you're proud of yourself. This isn't over. Sarah immediately called Detective Crawford, who traced the message back to a burner phone purchased with cash untraceable, but clearly violating Jonathan's no-contact restrictions. This gives us grounds for bail revocation, Crawford confirmed. Judge Martinez takes protection order violations seriously, especially when they involve threats to domestic violence survivors. Within hours, Jonathan was back in custody, his bail revoked pending trial. Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she realized her sister and nephew were finally truly safe from immediate physical threat. How are you feeling about all this? Sarah asked Rebecca that evening as they sat in the NICU watching Matthew sleep peacefully. Guilty, Rebecca admitted quietly. Dozens of people lost their jobs when Sterling Tech collapsed. Jonathan's parents are devastated. His business partners are facing lawsuits. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just stayed quiet and endured it. Sarah recognized the classic survivor's guilt taking responsibility for consequences that actually resulted from the abuser's choices, not the victim's courage in speaking truth. Becca, you didn't destroy those jobs. Jonathan destroyed them when he chose to abuse his power and commit federal crimes. You didn't ruin his parents' lives. Jonathan did that when he became a violent predator who used his family's resources to hurt vulnerable women. But if you hadn't fought back, he would have eventually killed you, just like he probably killed Lisa Chen in college. Then Matthew would have grown up with a murderer for a father and no mother to protect him. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, studying her son's peaceful expression. Do you think Matthew will ever have to know the details about his father? Someday, when he's old enough to understand. But by then, he'll have years of evidence that real men don't hurt the people they love. He'll know the difference between strength and violence. 3 weeks after Matthew's birth, he was finally ready for discharge. Rebecca had found a small apartment near the hospital with security features and proximity to her support network. She was also starting part-time therapy to process the trauma and rebuild her sense of personal agency. I want to go back to work eventually, Rebecca told Sarah as they prepared Matthew's nursery. Marketing, consulting, something that uses my education and gives me financial independence. What about childcare? Moms offered to help during the transition. Tyler's Firehouse has connections with reliable babysitting services for first responders' families. We'll figure it out. Sarah heard something new in her sister's voice. Confidence, planning, hope for the future. The woman who'd once been terrified of making any decision without Jonathan's approval was now taking charge of rebuilding her entire life. The legal proceedings moved forward with steady progress. Jonathan's criminal trials were scheduled for the following year, but his federal charges virtually guaranteed significant prison time. More importantly, the pattern of evidence from multiple victims created grounds for permanent protective orders that would prevent any future contact with Rebecca or Matthew. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, Rebecca confided during one of their weekly family dinners at Sarah and Tyler's house. For some legal loophole or technicality that lets Jonathan escape consequences? That's normal, Amanda assured her. Survivors of systematic abuse often struggle to believe their freedom is permanent. It takes time to trust that safety is real. Sarah understood her sister's caution. Years of living under Jonathan's control had taught Rebecca to expect punishment for any act of independence or resistance. Healing from that psychological conditioning would take longer than physical recovery from violence. But Sarah also saw daily evidence of Rebecca's growing strength. The way she advocated for Matthew's medical care, the confident manner in which she interviewed potential childcare providers, the firm boundaries she maintained with well-meaning relatives who suggested forgiveness and moving on too quickly. I'm proud of you, Sarah told Rebecca one evening as they watched Matthew learning to focus his eyes on colorful toys. Not just for surviving, but for how you're building a new life for both of you. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Rebecca replied. You came home from war to fight another battle for family? That means everything to me. Sarah thought about her military service, about the missions that had seemed so important at the time, about the lives she'd saved in combat zones thousands of miles away. None of those achievements felt as significant as helping her sister escape from domestic terrorism disguised as marriage. We protected each other, Sarah said simply. That's what sisters do. As winter settled over the city, their lives found new rhythms of healing and hope. Rebecca's therapy sessions helped her process trauma while building strategies for independent living. Matthew grew stronger and more alert daily, showing signs of the intelligence and spirit that would serve him well in a world where he'd be surrounded by protective adults who understood the difference between love and control. Jonathan's trials generated significant media coverage, inspiring other survivors to come forward and seek justice. Legislative proposals emerged for better legal protections for domestic violence victims facing wealthy abusers. Rebecca even testified before a state legislative committee about the unique challenges of escaping abuse when perpetrators had unlimited resources for legal manipulation. Every woman who speaks up makes it easier for the next woman to be believed, Rebecca told the legislators. My sister saved my life by refusing to be intimidated by wealth and power. Now I want to help other women find that same courage. Sarah watched her sister transform from victim to survivor to advocate, using her painful experience to create positive change for other women facing similar dangers. The war that had started in a hospital emergency room was ending with legislative hearings and legal precedents that would protect future generations of women and children. But first, they had to finish winning their own battle for permanent safety and justice. The final confrontation with Jonathan was still coming. The text message arrived on Rebecca's phone 6 months later. Just as she was preparing Matthew's bottle for his evening feeding, the number was blocked, but the message was unmistakably from Jonathan. Federal Appeals Court overturned my conviction. See you soon. Sarah's blood went cold when Rebecca showed her the message during their regular evening call. Jonathan had been serving an 18-month federal sentence while awaiting trial on additional charges. But appeals courts sometimes found technical procedural errors that could reverse convictions. Is that possible? Rebecca asked, her voice tight with the old familiar fear. I'll call Detective Crawford immediately, Sarah promised, switching into tactical mode. Even if there was a successful appeal, the state domestic violence charges and protection orders remain in effect. But privately, Sarah knew that Jonathan's release would change their security calculations dramatically. Wealthy criminals with scores to settle were dangerous in ways that went beyond simple violence. Detective Crawford confirmed their worst fears within the hour. Jonathan's lawyers found a procedural error in how federal investigators obtain initial search warrants. Appeals court ruled that evidence from Sterling Tech database searches was inadmissible. What does that mean for the other charges? State domestic violence conviction stands, but his sentence was reduced to time served plus probation. He's being released tomorrow with GPS monitoring and renewed protection orders. Sarah felt the familiar weight of mission planning settling on her shoulders. Jonathan's release wasn't just a legal development, it was a tactical situation requiring immediate response to protect civilian assets. What are his restrictions? No contact with Rebecca or Matthew, no approach within 500 feet of their residence or workplace, surrender of passport, weekly probation meetings, and continued GPS monitoring. And if he violates those restrictions, immediate arrest and return to federal custody, pending trial on remaining charges. Sarah understood that protection orders were only as effective as the enforcement mechanisms behind them. Jonathan's wealth and connections had already demonstrated their ability to circumvent legal obstacles. That night, Sarah and Tyler implemented enhanced security protocols for Rebecca and Matthew's protection. Motion sensors, upgraded locks, direct communication links to police dispatch, and a rotation schedule ensuring Rebecca was never alone with the baby. I feel like we're back where we started, Rebecca said as they tested the new alarm system. Living in fear, looking over our shoulders, waiting for Jonathan to make his next move. No, Sarah corrected firmly. We're not back where we started. You're not isolated. You're not financially dependent on him. You have legal protections, and you have a support network that won't abandon you. But he's still out there, still angry, still dangerous. Yes, and we're ready for him. The next morning brought news that Jonathan had indeed been released and was already testing the boundaries of his restrictions. He'd been seen driving slowly past Rebecca's apartment building, staying just beyond the 500-foot legal limit, but clearly conducting surveillance. He's probing our defenses, Tyler observed with the tactical assessment of someone who'd handled dangerous situations professionally. Seeing how we respond, what resources we have, how quickly law enforcement reacts to violations, Sarah agreed with her husband's analysis. Jonathan was conducting reconnaissance, gathering intelligence for whatever action he was planning. 3 days later, their preparation paid off when motion sensors detected someone attempting to bypass the security system at Rebecca's apartment. Police response was immediate, but the intruder had fled by the time officers arrived. Professional job, the investigating officer reported. Someone with technical knowledge of alarm systems and surveillance countermeasures. They were testing your security without triggering obvious violations that would send them back to prison. Sarah realized Jonathan had hired professional assistants, private investigators, security consultants, or worse. His release hadn't just restored his freedom, it had given him access to resources for planning sophisticated retaliation. We need to escalate our own preparations, Sarah told Tyler that evening. What are you thinking? Jonathan's not going to risk direct confrontation that would violate his probation terms, but he might hire others to take actions that can't be traced back to him. We need to be ready for professional-level threats. The next week confirmed Sarah's assessment when Rebecca received a job offer from a prestigious marketing firm in another city. The opportunity seemed legitimate, until background investigation revealed the company was owned by a shell corporation with ties to Jonathan's former business associates. He's trying to relocate you away from your support network, Amanda Wells analyzed. Get you isolated in a new city where you don't have family protection, legal advocates, or established medical relationships for Matthew? What if I'd accepted the offer? Rebecca asked. Mysterious accidents, custody challenges based on your inability to provide stable care in a new environment, gradual escalation of harassment until you agreed to reconciliation with Jonathan for Matthew's sake. The sophisticated nature of Jonathan's campaign was both impressive and terrifying. Even from prison, he'd been planning a comprehensive strategy to regain control over Rebecca and Matthew. But Sarah had been planning too. It's time for the final engagement, Sarah announced during a family strategy meeting that included Detective Crawford, Amanda Wells, and Jennifer Walsh from the Survivors Advocacy Organization. What do you mean? Rebecca asked. Jonathan's going to keep escalating until he forces a direct confrontation. We need to control the terms of that confrontation, ensure it happens in circumstances where his actions are fully documented and witnessed. Detective Crawford understood immediately. Controlled sting operation. Let Jonathan think he succeeded in isolating Rebecca. Then document whatever he does when he believes he has the advantage. That's incredibly dangerous, Rebecca protested. What if something goes wrong? What if he hurts Matthew? Matthew won't be anywhere near the operation, Sarah assured her. This is about creating irrefutable evidence that Jonathan remains a threat despite his probation restrictions. Over the following week, they implemented a carefully orchestrated plan. Rebecca would appear to be alone at her apartment during Matthew's scheduled medical appointment, while actually being surrounded by law enforcement surveillance and protective personnel. Jonathan took the bait within hours of the apparent opportunity. Security cameras captured him disabling his GPS monitoring device, violating probation terms immediately. Hidden microphones recorded him instructing hired associates to retrieve my son and deal with anyone who interferes. When Jonathan and two associates breached Rebecca's apartment expecting to find her alone and vulnerable, they instead found Detective Crawford and federal agents waiting with arrest warrants. Jonathan Sterling, you're under arrest for violation of probation, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, in violation of federal protection orders, Crawford announced as handcuffs clicked around Jonathan's wrist for the final time. Jonathan's expression as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered was worth every risk they'd taken. For the first time in his life, his money and connections couldn't protect him from the consequences of his choices. This is entrapment, Jonathan protested as he was led away. I was set up by unstable individuals with personal vendettas. This is justice, Sarah replied calmly. You've been held accountable by people who refuse to be intimidated by wealth and power. 6 months later, Jonathan was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Sterling Tech's remaining assets were liquidated to pay restitution to victims and cover legal costs. Most importantly, permanent termination of parental rights ensured that Matthew would grow up free from his father's influence. How do you feel? Sarah asked Rebecca after the final sentencing hearing. Free, Rebecca replied simply. For the first time in years, genuinely free. Sarah watched her sister playing with Matthew in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by the family and friends who'd supported their fight for justice. Rebecca had not only survived domestic terrorism disguised as marriage, she'd transformed her survival into advocacy that had helped dozens of other women escape similar situations. You know what's interesting, Rebecca said as they prepared to leave the courthouse. I used to think strength meant enduring pain silently, accepting whatever treatment people chose to give me. Now I know strength means asking for help when you need it, speaking truth even when it's dangerous, and refusing to let powerful people hurt vulnerable ones. Sarah felt profound pride in her sister's journey from victim to survivor to advocate. The woman who'd once been too terrified to report domestic violence was now testifying before congressional committees about legal reforms to protect abuse survivors from wealthy perpetrators. As they walked toward their cars, Sarah's phone buzzed with an emergency dispatch from the hospital. Another domestic violence case, another woman in crisis, another opportunity to use her skills and experience to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. Go, Rebecca said, recognizing the look on Sarah's face. Someone else needs what you gave me. Sarah hugged her sister and nephew goodbye, then headed toward the hospital where another battle was beginning. But this time, she carried the confidence of someone who'd proven that even the most powerful predators could be defeated by people willing to fight for justice. The war that had started with Rebecca's desperate cry for help in the emergency department had ended with legislative changes, legal precedents, and a new generation of advocates committed to protecting vulnerable women and children. But Sarah knew there would always be another emergency call, another woman in crisis, another chance to prove that love and courage could triumph over wealth and violence. "Please, somebody help me," came the familiar cry as Sarah entered the hospital. "We've got this," she replied as moving toward the sound with the steady confidence of someone who'd learned to win battles that others thought were unwinnable. The mission continued. The victory was permanent. And Matthew Sterling would grow up in a world where his mother's courage had made safety possible for countless other families facing similar dangers. Justice, Sarah had learned, wasn't just about punishment for perpetrators. It was about creating a world where the next generation didn't have to fight the same battles their parents had survived. The war was over. The peace was just beginning.